are ahead of that. Local governments who aren't are kind of scratching their head going, okay, what do we do?
I saw another question back here.
Hi, I'm Jerry Vanderwood with AGC. Question for Keith. In the governor's executive order, the portion about transportation, and you're talking about money to help local governments improve efficiency in transportation. I'm just wondering if you could define efficiency a little bit, and is it a synonym for reducing congestion? And if there's anything in there that is a kind of a shift away from road building.
So the governor's budget proposal for this last legislative session included a grant program for transportation efficiency. But part of the intent was to let local governments decide what that meant for them, whether it was commute trip reduction, whether it was separate freight corridors, whether it was separation grades with the railroad. Each local community seems to be tackling it a little differently. So at this point, we aren't excluding new construction or behavioral demand management.
Saw another one right here.
Michael Mann with Cyan Strategies. As we move forward in this debate that the governor's put in front of us about cap and trade, carbon tax, I'd love to get your thoughts before you have to leave, Keith, and Dennis, yours as well. That carbon tax in some ways is an elegant economic solution, but a little bit of a blunt tool that could have unintended impacts on various sectors. And as we move forward in this conversation, what are the vulnerable economic sectors that you see, Dennis and Keith, that we should be paying attention to in Washington State for our economy? What is that trade-dependent sector that could be more negatively affected by a carbon tax than some sort of a cap and market mechanism system?
So I'll just, in both systems, you can create exceptions, right? You can say this, everyone gets taxed, but, or you don't get taxed until. We've heard from the forest products industry, competes with the Southeast, competes with Asia. We've heard from the steel industry. I've heard from the aluminum industry. And they've all been constructive engagements. They're going, we don't really play in California, and that's really not our competitors. So if you're going to create a market system that isn't a bunch of states balkanizing the policy across you need to come up with something coherent. Some companies are international. We're buying our fuel in Finland, and we pay taxes in China. How can you deal with that? So I think one of the things the task force has been asked to look at is how do you link in a way that creates a coherence from a business perspective, and there's a lot of business folks on the task force to advise us. But you can take a trading scheme and provide allowances for those kinds of energy-intense businesses up front. That's what the Inslee-Doyle Amendment did in Congress, was to address our unique manufacturing sector. You can do something similar with carbon tax. The UK, Australia, and others have experimented with hybrid systems. And there's some appeal to that, not dragging agriculture into market trading, or not dragging waste management into market trading and letting them contribute through a fee process and be done with it. So I don't know that either one has a greater strength or weakness. It sort of depends on the signal, whether it's entirely economic or whether you want an additional regulatory signal to be in there to create a supply-demand pressure.
Keith covered that really well, but I think the devil is in the design, and we're fortunate to now have other systems that have been in place for a number of years in other places that we can learn from. The last meeting of the task force, the Brits came over with their experience in the EU with their system, but we've got a number of issues that have arisen in various systems that have been designed, and there are a number of these issues like the ones that you point out, people that are in international trade, but there are different systems, cap and dividend, you take the money and put it back, tax with revenue neutral elements to it. So you've got a lot of flexibility, but the devil is in how you design it to respond to the sectors that you've got in your particular economy so that you're able to design something that's responsive to those issues.
The last question for Keith here. Do you want to add one more thing, or you got to run out the door right now?
As long as I can answer Mike while I'm standing.
Okay.
Mike Gresh, transportation lobbyist. Along those lines, I think one of the most valuable resources that people don't talk about is our taxing capacity. And I know I've worked with the governor, I've worked with Keith's counterparts on transportation. The governor's a very strong advocate of working on our transportation system. But if you use up your tax capacity, it's an opportunity lost. So my concern about how are we going to accomplish both the improvements in transportation to help our economy, to move people and goods, and yet if we do these other mechanisms, and I know you say there's a lot of ways to design them, but if you use up that capacity and it's a transfer of tax capacity to offset things, then you've lost the opportunity to pay for your transportation system. So comments on that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. The governor's not going to lose sight of either what's possible or the fact that without transportation system improvements, there's a big missed hole, both on the emission side, the opportunity there, but on the job side and the economic side. That's one of the functions of government that Dennis Spade mentioned to, an obligation to maintain the infrastructure on which businesses can then succeed. The question of whether or not tax capacity is measured based on where we've been on a per capita basis or on what we need versus education and transportation, that's an open debate. And in fact, we went back and forth on whether we would ask the task force to comment on what to do, whether there should be revenue from any carbon program and what to do with the revenue. We figured we wouldn't even ask that question because that's what the legislature was going to want to debate. I mean, we'll bring a proposal, but whether there's any revenue and how to take advantage of it will be important. And what it does to these other initiatives will be central. So you're asking the right question. I don't have an answer. And I do apologize for needing to run. Dennis, just use a lower voice when you imitate me.
Thank you so much, Keith. All right, let's hear from Dennis.
Okay, well, I'm going to jump into my prepared remarks, and then we'll have a little more time for question and answer, but I won't be able to tag team it, so that's not as much fun. Well, thanks to the Clean Technology Alliance and the Chamber for inviting me here to speak today, and especially for inviting me to talk about climate and carbon regulations. I have a pretty broad sweep in the range of issues that we deal with at EPA Region 10, and I spend a lot of time on water. So it's great to connect back with climate, and I have been working on this issue for quite a long time here in Washington State, and it's great for me, well, since my pre-EPA days, as Keith said, and so it's great to reconnect with a number of you that I know in the audience here and see some new faces. But today I'm going to talk about what we're doing at EPA, and it is in response to the President's Climate Action Plan. If you haven't read that, you should. It is very compelling in terms of what he wants to accomplish during the rest of his administration, and since I'm a presidential appointee and my boss is a presidential appointee, we're going to work really hard to get it done in the 2.5 years that we've got left. And so there is a sense of urgency for us. I think the National Climate Assessment was great to see it come out just in advance of our 111D rule for existing power plants, because it helps create some of that sense of urgency. And I think something really well done in that report was to break it down regionally and then talk about it regionally around the country so that people would see themselves in it. And so that's a good thing. And of course, not every day do I get an audience like this willing to listen to a bureaucrat talk about obscure sections of the Clean Air Act like 111B and 111D, so I'm going to take advantage of that. But if you see one of your colleagues falling face first into their mashed potatoes, wave at me and I'll try and make it more interesting. But in any event, it is great to take a few minutes and talk about the new air rules that we've got coming at EPA, and certainly a top priority for Gina McCarthy, our administrator, and for all of us in the management of EPA is taking action on climate change. It's our #1 priority for the remaining time that we've got in this administration. It's certainly important that we've had a president say that this is a moral obligation for us to address this, and we're taking that very seriously. And The science, of course, is very strong on this. I know you've had an earlier meeting on that, but carbon pollution is a significant public health threat now and for our children and for our grandchildren. And we have the benefit at EPA of having been given authority under the Clean Air Act and having now had the Supreme Court rule that the Clean Air Act does give EPA that authority, and having had that affirmed a number of times, we're moving forward. And we believe that carbon pollution and climate change are a threat to our economy as well. So this isn't just an environmental issue, this is an issue fundamental to keeping our economy moving forward. When there are threats to your infrastructure, when there are threats to the very existence of some of your institutions as a result of the kind of changes that we're going to see from climate change, it's really imperative for us to act on this, both as an environmental issue, but as an economic issue as well. And the first goal of the Climate Action Plan from the President, cutting harmful pollution, that is front and center for EPA. EPA is taking steps on both the transportation sector and the power sectors to improve energy efficiency in homes, businesses, and factories, and to reduce methane and HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons. And as I think most of you know, nationwide, Washington's a little different, but nationwide, power plants are the most significant generators of carbon pollution, and they account for about 40% of the greenhouse gases in the nation's carbon pollution across the country. Here in Washington State, where we have a large amount of hydropower, transportation is our largest sector, but we still have work to do in the energy sector here as well. And there have been changes in recent years in the types of power plants and how they're operated, and that's resulted in lower emissions, and a lot of that is market driven because we are seeing increased penetration of cheaper natural gas into the markets. But the existing fleet of very old coal-fired power plants is a significant issue nationwide still. And if you live in the Midwest or in the eastern states, most of your electricity comes from these large old coal-fired power plants. And so the President's plan calls for EPA to issue carbon pollution standards for new and existing power plants, both what will be constructed going forward and what will replace that old fleet, and what should be done with the existing fleet of power plants that are out there. And so we have proposed new rules over a year ago now on the construction of new power plants. That's the 111B rule if you're keeping up on your Clean Air Act sections. New large natural gas-fired turbines are going to have to meet a pollution standard, as well as small natural gas turbines, which have a slightly different standard, but both are going to have to meet significant standards. I won't go into depth in terms of what those are, because whether it's 1,100 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour or 1,200 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour, that's probably not very meaningful to folks, but know that we are capping the emissions from new power plants going forward, and that will change the look of the fleet going forward, and they will be much lower in terms of carbon pollution. There is flexibility in terms of new power plants. There's a lot of energy around the supposed war on coal by this administration. There is not a war on coal. The market forces are changing what's happening with respect to the fleets out there anyway. And what we're doing is trying to set limits on what's achievable, where we know there are technologies that are available to achieve lower limits. And that's what we're trying to drive. We also, of course, recognize that there's a tremendous opportunity in solar and other renewables, wind power. We're seeing a tremendous growth in renewables in Washington State, a lot of that driven by not only federal tax credits, but certainly the renewable portfolio standard in the state of Washington. That really is driving some significant changes in even our energy supply in a fairly low carbon state to start with. I think for existing power plants, that's the one that's coming. That's the one that I'm particularly excited about, because we'll be issuing that on June 2nd. And the guidelines for that are still undergoing interagency review. So there's still pieces of it. As I was traveling with the administrator last Thursday and Friday, she was on the phone constantly with tweaks and questions from the White House, and with folks about what the final will show, but there's really been a pretty unprecedented effort to make these new rules for existing power plants out there be flexible, be not threatening a reliable, affordable energy supply going forward for the country. We've heard from a lot of folks that flexibility in terms of dealing with any carbon targets for states related to existing power plants is really important state by state, because each state is a little bit different. We've also heard that, and have known this for a long time, but have been really trying to bring groups of utility regulators and utilities together to talk about multi-state issues. We know that there is a system of interconnected grids, that there is coal by wire coming into states, and we'd like to encourage multi-state collaboration, so we've got to create the time and flexibility for that to occur. And again, we're interested in trying to make market-based solutions be a big part of this in terms of how do you drive reductions in carbon pollution, but do it in a way that creates market opportunities to do that, creates opportunities for new technology and innovation to go forward. And you know, in its basic form, what 111D will do, this rule that's coming out for existing power plants, is that it will require each state to limit carbon pollution, put a plan together to limit carbon pollution from the electricity sector. And we've heard you know, input from a variety of sources, like I mentioned, that if you set a limit, we will figure out how to deal with that, but give us the flexibility to deal with it within the dynamic in our own state. Some states, like Washington State, have already been doing things for a number of years, have RPSs in place, have agreements for power plants to phase out over time. In Washington, we have a phase out by 2025 of Centralia. States like Oregon have Boardman phasing out by 2020. So we've been listening very hard to all of that input. I think we had a really unprecedented set of listening sessions. We went around the country. I think I had 300 people in a room here, and then I also convened a session down in Portland with utility regulators and all the utilities in the Rocky Mountain West and in the Pacific Northwest to talk about potential for collaboration and what their issues were, make sure we were educated on the issues that they might face in dealing with the rule on existing power plants. So I think when you see what we come out with on 111D, it will require state-by-state plans, it will have a lot of flexibility in it, and it will be something that's very responsive to the issues and the concerns that we've heard from folks around the country about affordability, reliability, ability to develop market-based approaches to resolution of this. I can't tell you more. I'd love to tell you more. I've been fully briefed on it, but if I did tell you more, we'd all have to stay in this room until June 2nd and not leave, so can't do that. So let me switch gears and talk a little bit about carbon pollution and transportation and what EPA's done and is doing in that regard. That's a big issue in Washington State because of the mix that there is here, but we've now issued 2 phases of tailpipe rules for automobiles for the transportation sector. And the good news is that by 2025, the fleet will be required to achieve 54.5 miles per gallon across the board. And that's a big, that's essentially a doubling of the requirements for CO2 reduction from tailpipes over time. And that was achieved with the support of the automobile industry. And that is pretty remarkable, because when I was doing this in Washington State and we were adopting the California car rules, it was not supported by the automobile industry. So to see that turnaround and to see the support that the President's gotten for the rules that EPA and the Department of Transportation has adopted is significant. So we're getting existing power plants, we're getting new power plant regulations, we're working on issues with respect to tailpipe rules and CO2 and fuel economy from the automobile sector. We're working on large trucks. For the very first time, we put standards out for the very large trucks that carry goods across America. And I think the good news is a lot is happening, but it's not economy-wide. It is big chunks, and I think when you see what we achieved with 111D, you'll see that we're getting a lot, but we're not getting economy-wide. And that's where this issue of how much can you do on the executive side with your existing authority versus what you might need in terms of legislation comes up, and Ashley framed that fairly well. So we're doing everything we can, and we've got an imperative from the President to do that, and we're using our Clean Air Act authority to move forward on this. We've got other things going on as well that help in this regard to achieve the kinds of improvements in fuel economy in the transportation sector you need to enable new technologies, and that means things like cleaner fuels to allow those technologies to work. So our Tier 3 rules are requiring dramatic reductions in fuel sulfur levels for gasoline, and that enables technologies like gasoline direct injection engines and more advanced technologies that work better and more efficiently and enable the auto manufacturers to build engines that can meet the fuel economy standards. So we're thinking about this as a whole system. We're thinking about it, not just in terms of saying you'll meet this mandate, but we're also looking at what it takes to be able to meet that mandate in terms of fuels and technologies and that sort of thing as well. So lots going on in that. I think all of our vehicle programs are being closely coordinated, and we're trying to be intelligent about that, and not every one of those rules is supported by everybody. We're getting support of the automobile industry, for instance, for the fuel sulfur reductions, but the refining industry isn't too thrilled about the reductions in sulfur in gasoline to enable those technologies. And so we do see numbers thrown around about what will that mean in terms of the price of a gallon of gasoline. We think probably 1 or 2 cents. You hear the refinery industry talking about 8 or 9 or more cents, but we think the 1 or 2 is the more likely outcome in that regard. And it's really important not only for climate change, but also for public health, because we still know that we have a number of cities in the country that have public health problems associated with air pollution from the conventional pollutants as well. So just in finishing the prepared remarks here, I think really important to say that what we're trying to do is develop a variety of programs and tools here that stimulate market innovation, that stimulate responses from folks that are predictable, have a time frame associated with them that allows that market to respond. And we know that in the past with the Clean Air Act, we've seen lots and lots of regulation occur, but what we've seen is that the economy has flourished. People have been able to adapt and innovate. With these fuel economy rules, we're going to see dramatic savings to consumers, 3,000–4,000, maybe more, depending on what your fuel economy and size of vehicle is now, and you're switching out to in terms of consumer savings in reduced fuel costs as well. Reduce fuel costs while we, at the same time, reduce carbon pollution and reduce air pollution. So trying to be smart about this. One other element that I just wanted to mention, because I think here in Washington State this is particularly fun to watch, is that the President has called, as part of the Climate Action Plan for the Departments of Agriculture, Energy, Interior, and Labor and Transportation and EPA to develop a comprehensive methane strategy. And at the end of March, the administration announced a pretty robust and targeted strategy, and EPA's role is to address methane emissions from a number of sectors, including landfills, coal mines, agricultural sources, and the oil and gas sector. And one that, well, we don't have a lot of coal and fracking in the region here, fortunately for us, but we do have agriculture, and and we do have landfills. So we're going to be updating our requirements for landfills. And in June, in partnership with the dairy industry, USDA, EPA, and DOE will release a biogas roadmap. Who ever thought I'd be talking about a biogas roadmap, but we're going to have one. And it's going to identify strategies for accelerating adoption of things like methane digesters and other cost-effective technologies to reduce U.S. dairy sector methane pollution by 25% by 2020. And we have some great opportunities here in the region. In Region 10, we've been working for the last few years on several digester projects. One particularly interesting one is over in the Yakima Valley, where we have groundwater contamination problems. And WSU has developed a technology that allows not only you to recapture the methane gas, but also to capture the nitrates that are going into the groundwater and make that into a marketable fertilizer product. So we're looking for those kind of opportunities where there's innovation, where there's market-based opportunities that can provide a little more revenue to the farmer, but solve environmental problems at the same time, including climate change and things like groundwater pollution. So it's going to be fun to see some of those folks who are looking to convert their gasoline or diesel engines over to compressed natural gas to have the opportunity to do it with biogas, which is absolutely the best way to reduce climate emissions. So lots of opportunities here in Washington State, and we've got a number of people at the region engaged with state partners and partners at Climate Solutions and a variety of other organizations who are working on these solutions going forward. And I think our job at the EPA is to create the settings that allow the marketplace to respond in a way that fills the needs of industry and governments and the public's health at the same time. We're trying to be smart about that. We're trying to listen. We're trying to be as intelligent in framing it as we can and create opportunities for people to make money while doing good things and improving the environment and improving climate as well. So I'll stop with that and maybe go to questions here.
So, my first question is, who's going to sue you guys first? Come on, seriously. Who's the most angry?
Well, you know, I think on 111D, the Midwestern utilities have expressed the most anxiety about what might be in a rule. So they're, don't know if they will sue, but they're certainly making that noise.
But here in Washington, coal is, well, Puget Sound Energy does get a large, I was surprised how much of their power comes from Colstrip, Montana, the coal plant there. Is this going to force their hand, to Washington's hand, to phase out or force Puget Sound Energy off of that power? And if so, are we ready?
Well, number one, I think, there are folks who are willing partners in that to start with that are looking in that direction anyway. And so what having 111D will do is it will create an incentive for people to find solutions that are lower carbon. And it will, state by state, give the states the opportunity to do a plan that says, my energy portfolio from existing power sources is X. I've done Y already, and I need to do Z to get to what the target is. And so it will create incentives for reducing the carbon footprint state by state by state, and each state will have flexibility to develop a plan that is consistent with what they have in their energy mix and will create incentives to reduce carbon.
Incentives, right, but does it create, is it going to force that transition off of coal?
Well, the reason I dodged the word force is and again, I'm trying not to go too far into the details of what this really does and extract myself from today with the job still, is that it will set targets and it will then have each state have to meet those targets, but it creates the flexibility state by state by state to develop a response to that target that's unique to the individual state. And it can create opportunities for multi-state collaborations as well. Some of those states that are large coal electricity producers are very concerned about what it might mean for their state if there's not multi-state collaboration and opportunities, and that creates an opportunity for states that do take some coal by wire to be part of a regional approach to reducing that. So I can't go much farther than that without spilling the beans.
It's my job, just to make you a little uncomfortable. One of the first radio stories I ever did was about a methane digester that was being put into a dairy farm in Vermont, actually. So it's exciting to hear about that starting to happen for real out here. I want to open it up to questions. But
Well, reducing carbon from industry and transportation is great, but if our reduction then leaves more coal to be shipped overseas, coal trains and oil trains or whatever, then, and it's burned overseas, well, it doesn't solve any problem, right? And there's all these plans for dramatic increases the amount of export of fossil fuels. So is there any national strategy to leave coal in the ground or to stop the coal trains and the oil trains? Because if we don't do that, then are we wasting our time?
I'll let the applause die down. We have been involved in that issue from EPA. You know, our role at EPA is not to be the decision maker with respect to coal export or oil transport, but it is to make sure that the environmental reviews are robust and take into account, you know, what the consequences would be. So I've written some pretty strong letters to the Corps of Engineers with respect to the Northwest coal exports, asking that there be a robust environmental review, and
Which they ignored.
However, it's not over yet, Ashley. There's not even a draft EIS out on the table to comment on yet. So you know, there's more to come in that regard. And I think, is there a national strategy with respect to that? No. I think the carbon, you know, the president's plan, though, requires that overall we reduce our carbon emissions, and if we don't see international emission reductions, it's problematic. And so we are working, we've sent a couple of delegations over to China to talk with China and other Asian countries about their emission profile going forward. And I have to say, I'm actually seeing some pretty encouraging things on the horizon in terms of regions and cities in China establishing cap and trade mechanisms. Though they get this too, and you know, part of what they see and say, and I'm sympathetic to this, is that we have become very high per capita carbon consumers as we developed our economies, and some of those economies are still developing economies. So figuring out how we reduce the world's carbon footprint while allowing those economies to grow is one of the big challenges going forward. And you know, my hope is they don't do it with coal. And they are, you know, building as fast as they can renewables. You know, I'm seeing some pretty encouraging signs in terms of the projections turning in the right direction, even in China, from some of our NGOs that are working closely with the Chinese government. So, yes, you know, we're very energized here about coal export, and we're very energized about oil export. Right now, we can't export crude oil under the Magnuson, some legislation that Magnuson produced. Some people are trying to break that cap on exports, but we have a crude oil export ban. The coal is an issue that we're going to struggle with for the next few years, but I think the market may turn in a way that may make that, you know, just hypothetical rather than real.
Thank you. There's been some discussion of the role of the agricultural sector, both in terms of how do you help them adapt to the climate change stresses that are coming, and then also their role in mitigation, where certain things they do and the certain inputs they use could actually help mitigate by carbon sequestration and so forth. To what extent is the EPA and USDA working on an integrated plan for really looking at how to incent the farming sector? And it's particularly a very big economic impact in the eastern Washington to both successfully adapt to the climate change which is coming, which is warmer winters, wetter springs, and hotter summers, and maybe with some incentives, actually be incented to do a little extra than just adapt, where they actually have mitigation values.
Yeah, we're you know, very interested in the opportunities there, and we're trying to learn as much about that as possible. I think we're very fortunate in Washington State to have both some non-governmental organizations that are working hard on the opportunities in agricultural, as well as Washington State University and some of the work that some of the experts at WSU have. I've seen some dynamite presentations from folks around what the opportunities are, both from the NGOs and from the WSU folks. And what we're trying to do in the region is make sure that we're connecting those people with our national folks so that it does become part of the integrated strategies as we develop our adaptation plans. EPA has put together And all of the federal agencies have now put together adaptation plans going forward that include what sort of things we can bring from each of the sectors to the table. And USDA, of course, is particularly concerned about bringing that agricultural piece to the table, but we also at EPA are trying to learn and bring that to the party as well.
Another question?
Hi, Peter Hapke with Advocates Law Group. Dennis, I was wondering if you could just comment on the status of regulations related to fracking, trying to control some of the environmental issues related to oil and gas fracking.
Sure. Well, natural gas is, it's quite ironic. A few years ago, we were looking at import terminals for liquefied natural gas, and now we've got lots of proposals for export of liquefied natural gas. And so abundant, less expensive natural gas is changing the energy dynamic going forward. I think most of us hope that it's a bridge to a lower carbon future because there's carbon associated with natural gas as well. The worst situation would be to not pay attention to the wheels to wells aspect of this, where if you're not paying attention to the methane that's released at the wellhead, and you're not paying attention to the methane that might be released at the compression stations, or when you deliver the fuel, or even in some circumstances applying the fuel to the wrong application, where if it's liquefied natural gas and it's cryogenic and it sits too long, then you have to vent it because it's gaining pressure. So you have to pay attention to that whole aspect. We have put some rules together that address the aspect of at the wellhead in terms of the casings and retaining the methane and the gas at the casings. Largely, fracking is regulated by the states, and a lot of the concern is with the impact on water supplies as well, but there's a lot of work going in on this. We're focused in on making sure that the system is tight so that it actually realizes the greenhouse gas reduction potential, because it can be 20 to 40% reduction depending on the applications.